My name is Valentina Cruz. I am 31 years old, and I used to believe that if you were quiet enough, careful enough, and grateful enough, a family would eventually accept you as one of their own. I was wrong. I grew up in a house where the table was always set before anyone sat down at it. My father, Ernesto Cruz, taught me that the preparation was the point, that the work you did before anyone arrived was the work that actually mattered. He ran a regional distribution company out of San Antonio, Texas, nothing flashy, just a warehouse network that moved dry goods and medical supplies to hospitals and small grocers across the hill country. He built it himself over 22 years, starting with one refrigerated truck and a contract he typed on a machine he borrowed from a neighbor. By the time I was in middle school, he had 43 employees and a facility on the south side of the city that he was quietly proud of. He showed it by arriving first every morning and leaving last every night, and by knowing the name of every person who worked for him. I watched all of that. I took notes, the way children do when they don't have language yet for what they're absorbing. I learned that competence is not loud. I learned that the person who actually runs a room is usually the one standing slightly to the side of it. And I learned, this one took longer, that not every family operates that way. My father kept his important documents in a leather portfolio case, flat under his arm, never swinging, never ostentatious. I grew up watching him carry it into rooms the way other men carried briefcases, except he never made a production of it. You only found out what was inside when he decided you needed to know. That was how we operated. I met Marco Delgado Ibarra in my second year of graduate school at a seminar on regional supply chain logistics. He sat 2 seats down and asked a question during the Q&A that was exactly right. Specific, practical, the kind of question that tells you the person already knows the answer and is checking whether the presenter does too. I liked him immediately. We dated for 14 months before he introduced me to his family. His father in particular, Marco said, was complicated, and he wanted to make sure things between us were solid before he brought me into that. I accepted this. I was 26 and I was in love, and I told myself that a man who was thoughtful about protecting me from difficulty was a man worth keeping. His father was Rodrigo Ibarra. He owned a commercial real estate development firm in Houston. Mid-size, well-connected, the kind of operation that didn't need to advertise because its clients came through relationships that went back a generation. Rodrigo had done it with family money behind him and a father-in-law who handed him his first 3 contracts. He never acknowledged this. In his telling, he was a self-made man, and anything that complicated that narrative simply did not exist. Marco's mother, Sylvia, was pleasant in the way that very careful people are pleasant. She never said anything directly unkind, but she had a way of asking questions that left you feeling reduced. She asked where I had gone to school before UTSA, whether my parents still lived in San Antonio, whether my father's company was a franchise or an original operation. She phrased everything politely. She meant every question as a measurement. Marco's younger sister, Pilar, was warmer, genuinely so. She was 24 and working for a nonprofit in Austin, and she had her brother's habit of asking questions that were sharper than they appeared. She liked me, I think, because I didn't try too hard around her. Marco and I got engaged the October after I finished my degree. We planned a wedding for the following September. 380 guests, then 412 by the final count, because Rodrigo Ibarra's social circle had a way of expanding every invitation list it touched. The week before the wedding, Rodrigo announced, not asked, announced, that he was hosting the rehearsal dinner at his club instead of the restaurant Marco and I had chosen. Marco told me that evening in a tone that expected me to accept it as the way things were. I squared the papers I had been reviewing before I answered. Did he ask you first? I said. He mentioned it, Marco said. That's not the same thing, I said. Marco looked at me with an expression I would come to know over the following 2 years, not unkind, not dismissive, but slightly tired, as though I had raised a technical objection to something that everyone else had already agreed to accept. It'll be fine, he said. It's one dinner. I let it go. I had no idea yet that this was the first brick in a wall that would eventually require a very specific kind of demolition. If you are watching this and you have ever sat at a table where you felt like a guest in a family you legally belong to, I want you to stay with me, because what happened on my anniversary night did not come from nowhere, and the way it ended is not what anyone in that room expected. The rehearsal dinner was at Rodrigo's Club, a private establishment in the Galleria area of Houston with dark wood paneling and a membership that cost more annually than my first year's salary out of graduate school. Rodrigo had arranged everything, the seating, the menu, the order of the evening, and presented it to Marco and me when we arrived as though he were giving us a gift. Midway through the second course, Rodrigo asked about my father's company the way he always asked, with a slight forward lean that suggested mild curiosity and something else underneath. "And Ernesto is still running the distribution operation?" he said. "He is," I said. "He expanded the medical supply side last year. 3 new hospital contracts." Rodrigo nodded slowly. "Regional," he said. It was not a question. "Regional, yes. Hill country primarily, with some reach into the San Antonio metro." "Good for him," Rodrigo said, and then he turned to his brother Felipe and began a conversation about a commercial property deal in the Woodlands that had nothing to do with anything anyone else at the table was discussing. I had learned by then that "good for him" in Rodrigo Ibarra's register was not a compliment. It was a category assignment. It meant, that is a small thing and we will speak no more of it. The real incident happened after dinner, when the formal structure dissolved into clusters of conversation. I was standing near the bar with Sylvia and 2 of her friends when Rodrigo appeared with a glass of bourbon and the particular expression he wore when he had decided to perform for an audience. He began talking about the wedding, the venue, the flowers, the reception plan, in the first-person plural, as though he and Sylvia had organized it, which they had not. Marco and I had organized it, with help from my mother, who had driven up from San Antonio twice to meet with the wedding coordinator and had handled every logistical complication with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had spent decades watching my father run operations and had absorbed all of it. "We wanted something that reflected the family properly," Rodrigo said, speaking to Sylvia's friends rather than to me, though I was standing 2 feet away. "You know how these things go. If you don't have someone in the family who understands that, the whole event falls apart." "Valentina had some ideas," he said, still not looking at me. "We incorporated what made sense." I folded my cocktail napkin into a smaller square and said nothing. Pilar found me a few minutes later when I crossed the room to where she was standing with Marco's cousins. "How's it going over there?" she said. She had seen. She had a way of seeing things without looking directly at them. "Fine," I said. She handed me a glass of sparkling water and didn't push it. That was one of the things I liked best about her. The wedding the following afternoon was beautiful. The venue was a restored ranch property outside of Houston, and the October light came through the cypress trees at the angle it only hits in that particular stretch of Texas in the fall. My father walked me down the aisle in the gray suit he had quietly let out at the tailor the month before. He wasn't going to buy a new one when the old one still had years in it, and when we stood at the back of the ceremony space and he held my hand, my throat tightened in a way that had nothing to do with nerves. "You look like your mother the day I met her," he said. I held on to that sentence for the rest of the evening. Rodrigo gave a toast that was ostensibly about Marco but was primarily about Rodrigo, his vision for his son, the Ibarra family's legacy. He mentioned my family once, briefly, with the good people very warm phrasing that sits just above good for them on the dismissal register. My father listened with the expression he wore when he was deciding whether something was worth addressing. He decided it was not. He raised his glass when everyone raised theirs. The first year of our marriage, I learned the Ibarra family the way you learn a piece of equipment you didn't choose, by working with it until you understand its tolerances and its points of failure. By the end of that year, I had been promoted to senior operations analyst at the logistics firm, managing a team of 6 and overseeing a portfolio of regional distribution contracts that had grown by 30% since I joined. I was good at my job in the way that comes from having watched someone do a version of it your entire childhood and then spending 8 years studying the underlying discipline. I understood distribution networks the way some people understand languages. Not just the rules but the texture of them, the places where formal structure gives way to the actual human decisions underneath. Rodrigo did not ask about my work. Not once, in 2 years of Sunday dinners and holiday gatherings. He asked Marco about his constantly specific, substantive questions. He asked my mother, on the 2 occasions she came to Houston, whether she was still enjoying San Antonio, as though she were a tourist rather than a woman who had lived there for 34 years. He asked me once whether the commute was difficult. The clearest instance came at a Sunday dinner at the Ibarra House in River Oaks in March of our first year. Rodrigo was describing a logistics problem at a retail development in Katy, a distribution access issue complicating the site approval, and he was using the vocabulary of someone who understands real estate but not supply chain. He was describing the symptom, not the cause. I waited for a natural break and said, "The access issue. Is it the delivery window timing or the routing designation on the county permit?" A brief silence at the table. "The permit designation," Rodrigo said. "Why?" "I've seen that specific conflict twice," I said. "Both times the resolution came through reclassifying the delivery route as a secondary commercial access point rather than primary. It changes the county's review window. Usually 3 weeks instead of 6. Rodrigo looked at me for a moment. Then he looked at Marco. Then he said, "Interesting," and turned back to his story, incorporating the information without acknowledging where it had come from. I ate my dinner. I noted the response and added it to the record I was keeping. During those 2 years, I was not passive. About 6 months into our marriage, I had identified a structural inefficiency in the way smaller regional distributors were connecting with mid-size hospital systems in Texas, and I had begun building a business plan to address it. Concretely, with numbers, projected contracts, a financial model I rebuilt 6 times until I could defend every assumption. I met with 3 potential investors from my own professional network. I incorporated a holding entity in my own name. I secured 2 letters of intent from hospital procurement offices in the Hill Country. I had done all of this without detailing it to Marco. I had learned that Rodrigo had a way of applying his skepticism to ideas before they were ready to bear it. I had watched that wait-and-decide investment Marco had been quietly interested in, dismissed in 3 sentences at a family dinner before Marco had even fully described it. I was not going to let that happen to what I was building. My father knew from the beginning. He had listened to the whole plan on the phone for 45 minutes, asked 8 questions, and said at the end, "You've thought about this longer than you've been telling people." He co-signed 2 early funding conversations, not financially. He did not put his own money into my company. But as a reference, a person whose name in Texas distribution circles carried specific weight that I was not above using. I also kept a document. Dates, occasions, specific things Rodrigo said and did. I am not by nature a person who keeps receipts in the emotional sense. But something about the texture of what was happening, the consistency of it, always polite, always surrounded by the structure of warmth, told me that when the moment came I would want to be precise. In those 2 years, I contributed 63 hours helping Sylvia prepare and execute 6 family events, including 2 Ibarra Development Group client dinners that required my operational knowledge to run correctly. I spent 4 months untangling a vendor payment dispute Marco had inherited from a junior colleague at his firm, working through it on evenings after my own workday. I attended every family gathering, every Sunday dinner, every professional social event to which we were invited as a couple. I was present and prepared, and I was treated, in the aggregate, as though I were a pleasant feature of Marco's life rather than a person with a professional existence of my own. I let them believe that. Because I was not finished yet. Our first wedding anniversary fell on a Saturday in October, and Rodrigo announced, not asked, that he was hosting a dinner for us at the same club, inviting the same core group from the wedding. 400 guests, because Rodrigo did not make small gestures. Marco told me about it 2 weeks in advance, standing in the kitchen the same way he had told me about the rehearsal dinner venue change. "He's doing it as a gift," Marco said. "He's paying for everything. It would be strange to refuse." "I didn't say I was refusing," I said. "You have a look," Marco said. "I'm thinking," I said. Cruz Logistics Solutions, I had named it without complication, a deliberate choice, had 2 weeks prior closed its first investor funding round. $800,000 from 2 investors who had been watching the plan develop for the better part of a year. Real money, real terms. The company was no longer a plan. It was an operating entity with capital and 2 letters of intent and one very clear next step: converting those letters into signed contracts. I was close. I did not want to create a family conflict before I got there. So I agreed to the anniversary dinner. I bought a dark green dress, fitted, the kind my mother would have said makes a statement before you open your mouth. I agreed to 400 guests and the dark wood paneling and Rodrigo's club. My father drove up from San Antonio the morning of the dinner. When I had told him about it 3 weeks earlier, there had been a pause on his end of the line that I recognized. The pause he used when he was deciding whether to say the thing he was thinking or to wait. "Tell me the date," he said. I told him. "I'll be there," he said. "It's Rodrigo's event," I said. "I know what it is," my father said. "I'll be there." He arrived at 11 in the morning with my mother. He had the leather portfolio case under his arm, flat, the way he always carried it when the contents mattered. I did not ask about it. He would tell me what I needed to know when I needed to know it. The dinner began at 7. Rodrigo was already working the room when we arrived at 6:30, greeting Marco warmly and me with the Valentina, beautiful as always, he used as a bookmark, a phrase that acknowledged my presence and said nothing about it simultaneously. Pilar found me within the first 20 minutes and stationed herself nearby with the deliberate calm of someone who was keeping watch. "How are you doing?" she said. "I'm fine," I said. "You have the face," she said. "What face?" "The one where you're completely calm and I have no idea what that means," she said. I smiled at her. I meant it. At 9:15, Rodrigo moved to the microphone. He gave a toast that was, structurally, a toast to our first year of marriage, and was, functionally, a performance of the Ibarra family's vision for what this marriage was and would be. He talked about Marco's trajectory at the firm, the next decade of Ibarra Development Group, his hopes for new additions in the coming year. He did not mention my work. He did not mention my name except as Marco's wife. He did not acknowledge that two people's first year of marriage was being celebrated, not one. I kept my hands flat on the table and looked at the centerpiece. White flowers, very tall, the kind of arrangement that fills a room without demanding attention. Then Rodrigo remained at the microphone a moment longer and looked in my direction with something between indulgence and testing. "Valentina," he said. "Anything you'd like to add?" He expected something brief and gracious and entirely in line with the tone he had set. He expected me to be a pleasant feature. I stood up. And I made an error, I told the truth. Not all of it. Not yet. But enough. I said I was grateful for the evening and grateful for the family, and then I said, and this was the part that changed the temperature in the room, that I was also proud of what Marco and I had built in our first year, including the work each of us had done independently that had made us better partners. I named Cruz Logistics Solutions by its full name. No one in that room had ever heard it except my father, who was seated near the back, and Pilar, who had gone very still beside me. Rodrigo made a gracious comment about entrepreneurial spirit and sat down. At 10:40, he materialized beside me at the edge of the room, bourbon glass in hand. He did not lead with pleasantries. "That was an interesting choice," he said. "Thank you," I said. "I didn't mean it as a compliment," he said, voice low and pleasant in texture. Naming a business venture in front of 400 people, at an event I planned and paid for, without discussing it with me first, or with Marco, I assume, was an interesting choice. "I told Marco about Cruz Logistics," I said. "Not every detail, but the substance." "Then Marco should have told me," Rodrigo said. "That's how this family communicates. Through the proper channels." I squared my hands on the edge of the cocktail table and said nothing. "You're a capable woman," Rodrigo said. The register was exactly the same as good for him, and good people very warm. But capable isn't the same as ready. And whatever you're building, that's your project. This family has a direction. Marco has a role in that direction. I'd ask you to keep your side projects in proportion. He finished his drink and excused himself. I stood at the table for a moment after he left. My pulse had caught and steadied and caught again. I was angry. Not the sharp kind but the settled kind, the kind that has been accumulating in the background for a long time and has finally finished deciding what it is. I went to find Marco. He was near the bar with two of his father's associates. When he saw my face, he excused himself. "Did my father say something to you?" he said. "He did," I said. "I'll tell you later." "It's fine." Marco looked at me for a moment. "Val, maybe my dad has a point. About the timing. About how it came across tonight." I looked at him. "I'm not saying he was right about everything," Marco said quickly. "I'm just saying at an event like this, in front of his people, maybe it wasn't the moment." I folded the small cocktail napkin in my hand into a precise square. I did not say anything. "Valentina," Marco said, and something in his tone had shifted, something I recognized from his father and had not expected to hear from him. "My father is not wrong that there are ways things are done in this family. You've known that. You've always known that. I need you to understand that when he gives a dinner for us, it matters how we show up." "How we show up," I said. "How you show up," Marco said. "I know that's not fair. I know how it sounds." "Then don't say it," I said. He said it anyway. Not those exact words, but the version that landed was this: that I had embarrassed him, that I had used his father's dinner to make a point about myself, and that in this family there was a way things worked and I was making it hard. The room was very loud around us. 400 people and a band covering something from the 90s. I was standing in the middle of it, being told by my husband on our anniversary that my existence in this family was conditional on my willingness to be smaller. Marco raised his voice slightly, not shouting but trying to be heard over the music, or perhaps just tired of modulating. And then, in a moment that I think surprised him as much as it surprised me, his hand came up. The slap landed against my left cheek. Not hard in the way of someone trying to hurt me, but hard enough and open and in view of the tables immediately around us. The music didn't stop. But the 6 or 8 people closest to us went quiet, and then there was a small wave of it, the way silence travels in a crowded room. And then some of them laughed. Not all of them. Not even most of them. But enough of them, in that first terrible second, that I heard it clearly over the music. I did not react. I did not raise my hand. My eyes were sharp and wet at the edges. I looked at Marco, who looked back at me with an expression I had no category for at all, something between shock and a kind of helpless defaulting to the thing that had just happened. I turned and walked to the ladies' room. I stood at the sink for 2 minutes and looked at my face in the mirror. My left cheek was warm and slightly bright. Then I took my phone from my clutch and called my father. It rang once. "Dad," I said. "Please come." There was no pause this time. "I'm already walking," he said. My father was waiting in the corridor outside the ladies' room when I came out. He had the leather portfolio case flat under his arm. My mother had stayed in the room. She and my father had discussed this on the drive up from San Antonio that morning and had agreed that if this moment came, it would be better without an audience of 2. He looked at my face. He looked at the left cheek. He put one hand briefly on my shoulder, and that was everything. "Is Rodrigo still in the room?" he said. "Yes." "And Marco?" "Yes." "All right," my father said. "How do you want to do this?" I had been thinking about this moment for a long time. Not this particular evening, not this particular occasion, but the moment. The meeting. I had known for 3 months it was coming, and I had spent those months making sure what I brought to it was complete. "I'd like to do it at the table," I said. "In front of whoever is there." My father nodded once. "Then let's go back in." We walked back into the room together. The band was still playing. The crowd had resettled, the small ripple of quiet absorbed back into the general noise of 400 people at an open bar. Marco was at the head table. Rodrigo had returned to his seat with the bourbon glass and the performance of a man whose evening had not been interrupted. Pilar was at the table. She saw my father and me walk in together, and she went very still. I sat down. My father sat next to me and placed the portfolio case on the table in front of him with the same flat, deliberate movement he used when he was about to explain something he had already finished thinking about. Rodrigo noticed the case. People who build companies notice when documents appear at a table uninvited. "Ernesto," he said with the warmth he used for people he was assessing, Good to see you. I didn't know you were planning to join us. I was in the room earlier, my father said. I came to see Valentina. Of course, Rodrigo said, looking at the portfolio case. Is there something we need to discuss? There is, my father said. Marco was looking between his father and mine with the expression of a man who has just understood that something has been in motion for longer than he knew. My father opened the case. He reached in and produced a set of documents, placed them on the table in a clean stack, and positioned them so that both Rodrigo and Marco could see the top page. What you're looking at, my father said, is the current corporate structure of Cruz Logistics Solutions, which my daughter incorporated 18 months ago. He placed the second document beside the first. These are the signed contracts, not letters of intent, signed contracts as of 11 days ago, with 2 Hill Country Hospital Systems for regional medical supply distribution. Combined first-year contract value, $4.2 million. The number landed in the specific silence that numbers land in when they are larger than the room expected. Rodrigo looked at the documents. He did not reach for them. That's a meaningful first contract, he said, controlled. It is, my father said. He produced a third document. This is the distribution access agreement with the County Routing Authority, the reclassification Valentina described to you at your dinner table in March, about 18 months ago, when you were working through the Katy development logistics problem. She identified the fix. You used it. The same approach is built into Cruz Logistics Solutions' operational model. Something shifted in the architecture of Rodrigo's expression. A slight recalibration, the way a very controlled person responds when they realize the ground has moved under them without their noticing. I'm not sure what the purpose of this presentation is, Rodrigo said. The purpose, I said, is clarity. You've been very clear with me over 2 years about what you think I am in this family. I want to be equally clear about what I actually am. Marco said, Valentina. I'd like to finish, I said. He stopped. I looked at Rodrigo. You said, the night of our rehearsal dinner, that you had incorporated what made sense from my ideas about the wedding. What I was actually doing during those months was managing the logistical coordination between 3 vendors, a venue, and a wedding coordinator while working full-time and beginning the business plan for what is now Cruz Logistics Solutions. Rodrigo began to respond. I continued. At the 4th of July gathering 18 months ago, when your associate complimented how smoothly the evening ran, you agreed. You didn't mention that I had reorganized the service flow and solved a catering equipment failure that afternoon. I didn't say anything then either. Those are small, Rodrigo started. Tonight, I said, you told me that capable isn't the same as ready and that I should keep my side projects in proportion. I looked at the documents. $4.2 million in signed contracts, on a business I built while attending every dinner you invited us to, managing my own professional role, and contributing to this family in every way that was asked of me. That is the proportion. The table was quiet. Even the ambient noise of the room seemed to pull back slightly. You told Marco, in 14 months of Sunday dinners, everything you thought he needed to know about running a business. You never asked me a single substantive question about my work. Not one. That was your choice. I want you to know that I noticed it. Rodrigo looked at me for a long moment. You've been building this behind Marco's back, he said. I told Marco the substance, I said. I didn't give him the details. I've explained why. And why is that? Rodrigo said. Because I watched you dismiss a project Marco was interested in 3 sentences at a Sunday dinner 14 months ago, I said. He never mentioned it again after that. I was not going to let that happen to what I was building. Marco made a sound, not quite a word. I looked at him. I'm not angry at you, I said. I'm telling you what I saw. You can decide what to do with it. Rodrigo's voice had tightened. I think we have things to discuss, he said. The performance had come out of it. What was left was something more honest and more uncomfortable, which was the closest thing to progress available in that room. We do, I said. But not tonight. I picked up my clutch. I looked at Marco. His face was doing something complicated. the shock of the slap still somewhere in it, and underneath that something that might have been recognition or might have been the beginning of it. "I'll be at the hotel," I said. "Take whatever time you need." I walked out of the room. I did not hurry. I did not look back at Rodrigo's table, and I did not look for the faces of the people who had laughed. I walked at the pace of someone who has finished a thing she started a long time ago, and is not in a hurry because there is nowhere more important to be than where she already is. My father caught up with me in the corridor. He had the portfolio case under his arm again. "You didn't slam the door," he said. "There wasn't one," I said. He smiled at that, the same smile he used when I had solved a problem correctly at the distribution facility as a child, and he wanted me to know it without making it into a production. The fallout settled over the following weeks in the way fallout does, not cleanly, not all at once. Pilar called the next morning and talked for 40 minutes and cried twice and said, at the end, that she had seen this coming for 2 years and was sorry she hadn't said something sooner. I told her she had nothing to be sorry for. She had given me sparkling water at the rehearsal dinner and stationed herself next to me all evening and gone still at exactly the right moments, and that was its own kind of testimony. Sylvia did not call. I had not expected her to. Marco came to the hotel at 2 in the morning. We sat in the room and talked until almost 5, and it was the most honest conversation we had ever had, which should tell you something about the 2 years preceding it. He did not try to explain the slap. He said he was sorry. He said it 3 times, simply, without architecture. I believed him. What came after that is a longer story and not the one I'm telling here. But the conversation at 2 in the morning was real, and real was different from what we'd had before, and different was the only thing worth building on. Cruz Logistics Solutions signed its 3rd hospital contract 4 months after the anniversary dinner. By the end of that year, the company had 6 employees and a second investor and a distribution route that covered a region my father had spent 22 years learning. He was not involved in the day-to-day. That was the point. But he was the first person I called when the 3rd contract came in, and he answered on the first ring the way he always does. I think about what Rodrigo was actually afraid of, sometimes. I think the honest answer is that he was not afraid of me specifically. He was afraid of the thing I represented, a competence that had not come through his family, had not been validated by his network, had not needed his permission or his scaffolding to become real. People who have spent their lives being the person who confers legitimacy on others find it genuinely disorienting to encounter someone who simply did not require it. It doesn't make what he did acceptable. But it makes it human, which is the most complicated thing anything can be. The lesson I keep coming back to is not about revenge or about proving anything to anyone. It is something closer to this. The work you do before anyone is paying attention is the most important work you will ever do. Not because it earns you the right to a dramatic moment at a dinner table, though apparently it can, but because it is the work that tells you, in the long quiet months when no one is handing you credit, who you actually are. My father built a company on a borrowed typewriter and a refrigerated truck, and he knew the name of every person who worked for him, and he never once described himself as self-made. He said he was well supported. He said the truck didn't drive itself. He said that every time someone told him no, it was information, and information was the most useful thing anyone could give you. I raised my daughter, and that is a longer story too, one that starts about 8 months after the anniversary dinner, with that same idea in my pocket. That the preparation is the point. That the work before the room fills is the work that matters. That when someone tells you what category they've put you in, the correct response is not an argument. It is a ledger. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Sometimes the person sitting across from you needs the reminder that quiet doesn't mean absent. This story is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. Names, characters, businesses, events, and incidents are the products of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental.